In December 2025, for the first time in a long while, volunteers gained access to the Rostov shelter Forgotten Hearts. What they discovered there defied all description: animal remains, emaciated bodies, and evidence that what was happening here was anything but rescue. It is vital to understand how this story became possible in the first place, because the woman behind it all had been considered one of the region's leading animal rights activists for many years. Her name is Tatiana Makarova, and if you have ever sought help for a homeless kitten in Rostov-on-Don, you have almost certainly heard of her. Makarova created a shelter that took in everyone: dogs, cats, raccoons, foxes, squirrels, crows. She refused no one. The injured, the old, the sick, those rejected by veterinary clinics, those found in trash cans or abandoned after a move, they all ended up with her. On her Telegram channel, she posted before and after photos almost every day, along with touching rescue stories and regular pleas for help. People willingly transferred money, brought bags of food, and wrote words of gratitude in the comments. And practically no one questioned where all these animals actually went after they were handed over to the shelter. The geography of the intake was vast and only expanded with each passing year. Animals were sent from Astrakhan, Volgodonsk, and the DPR. From Astrakhan alone, more than 150 dogs were transferred to Forgotten Hearts in the last 6 months. Couriers, hitchhikers, volunteer networks, it all ended at the doorstep of Makarova's shelter, a place where animals were promised a second chance at a normal life. Television segments were filmed about her. Vesti Don released a report in 2022, and the newspaper Nasze Vremya wrote about her in 2023. When a residential building collapsed on Narimanova Street in Rostov, Makarova was one of the first on the scene, pulling cats from the rubble and taking in dogs left behind by evacuated residents. She wasn't just collecting animals from across the region. She built an entire public image around herself. A woman with a mission, a volunteer with a big heart, a person who takes on what others simply don't have the strength for. And it is precisely this image that has now fallen to pieces. Because what the volunteers discovered in her shelter in December spoke of a completely different reality. On the night of December 21, a group of volunteers led by Elena Kravtsova drove to the shelter's grounds. For months prior, they had been trying to get Makarova to do one thing: show them the animals they were sponsoring and had transferred to Forgotten Hearts. Every time, they were refused. Sometimes it was a quarantine, sometimes repairs, sometimes it was not a good time, come back later. At some point, negotiations simply ended, and the activists decided to come on their own without warning or coordination. When they approached the building, the first thing that caught their eyes was that the gates were not just open, but broken down. The doors were smashed. Inside was darkness, and a smell emanated from within that immediately caught in their throats. When they turned on their flashlights, it became clear that this place had long since ceased to be a shelter in any normal sense of the word. Remains lay everywhere, all kinds of animals that Makarova had ever accepted, in various stages of decomposition. Some were in cages, others lay directly on the floor, in the aisles, by the walls. Some had faded away recently, while others, judging by the state of the finds, had died months ago. Animal advocate Alexandra Holzberg later told journalists that you were literally walking on feces and on skulls, that everything crunched underfoot, and you could accidentally step on a cranium. She added that she hadn't seen anything like it, even in horror movies. The volunteers immediately called the police. When the officers arrived, they also stopped dead at the entrance. One of them later admitted that in all his years of service, he had never encountered anything like it. According to initial estimates, there were about 200 animals on the shelter's territory that could not be saved. According to other data, more than 300. Establishing an exact figure proved impossible because some of the remains had decomposed completely and were no longer identifiable. There were about 16 survivors. Emaciated to the bone, some could not even stand on their paws and just crawled. Some had fractures, old ones that had long since healed incorrectly or hadn't healed at all, and wounds that no one had treated. And here is what is especially significant. Lying next to them were untouched bags of food and entire packages of medicine. Everything was right there. The food, the medications, everything needed for care. Just no one fed them. No one treated them. The animals were fading away meters from the very things that could have saved them. And here, a question arises that could not fail to arise. How could a woman who for years built a reputation as the region's main animal protector allow this to happen? Perhaps she simply didn't know what was going on? Maybe she lost control of the situation? To understand this, one must go back to the very beginning of the story. Tatiana Makarova was born on November 27, 1981, in Rostov-on-Don. Her maiden name was Gurieva. An ordinary family, an ordinary childhood. Nothing that indicated what she would do in the future. Everything changed when she grew up and started picking up homeless animals. At first, she just took them into her own home. One dog, then a second, then cats. It was a classic volunteer story. She couldn't walk past them, and then she couldn't stop. At some point, the scale exceeded the capacity of an ordinary apartment. A friend offered help. A private house that could be used as a shelter. That was how Forgotten Hearts began. At first, everything was unofficial, without any registration. Just a place where you could bring an animal in distress and know it would be cared for. In the early years, everything did indeed look normal. Makarova was genuinely involved in finding homes for animals, posting advertisements, looking for owners, arranging foster care. Some animals found new homes, and photos of happy dogs with new owners regularly appeared on social media. People saw results, and this inspired trust. The shelter grew gradually. At first, it housed about 10 animals. Then the count went into the hundreds. Makarova rented new premises in the Reknik SNT. More space, more cages, more opportunities for rescue. That, at least, is how it looked from the outside. She created a Telegram channel and a group on VKontakte and began conducting systematic fundraisers for food, for treatment, for emergency surgeries. Money came in regularly. People believed and transferred funds. Reports were published dutifully. Photos of animals, receipts from veterinary clinics, words of gratitude from those who adopted pets. At this stage, Makarova was perceived as someone who had taken on more than others were capable of and was managing it well. She built a model that worked, brought in money, and built a reputation. And it was precisely this model, as would later become clear, that would turn into a trap, both for the animals and for those who trusted her. Because the first warning signs appeared long before the December catastrophe. It's just that no one heard them then, or didn't want to hear them. By that point, volunteer Amalia Yereshova had already been working in the animal protection environment for 7 years. She had met Makarova long ago. They crossed paths on shared cases, exchanged contacts, and helped each other with small things. A year and a half ago, Amalia turned to her with a request. She needed to find a home for an adult, Jack Russell Terrier, and 7 puppies. Makarova agreed immediately, came herself, took the animals, and promised to keep Amalia updated on how they were doing. After that, contact began to break off. Amalia asked to see the dogs, but every time Makarova found a reason to refuse, the same as with the other volunteers. The next week never came. Amalia was far from the only person who faced this situation. Other curators told the same story. They sent animals to Forgotten Hearts and lost all access to them afterward. Makarova gradually stopped posting information about the animals transferred to her, answered direct questions evasively, and sent photos less and less frequently. Some volunteers tried to take their charges back. It didn't work. Makarova would say the animal had already been placed with a new family, or that it was currently sick and couldn't be moved, or she simply wouldn't respond to messages, and that was where the conversation ended. In parallel, there were more and more animals in the shelter, which was clearly visible from her own posts. Every week, new faces appeared in photos on the channel, along with new rescue stories and new fundraisers. Some of the volunteers who did manage to get onto the territory noticed that the living conditions were worsening. The cages were overcrowded, the territory looked more neglected than before, and the smell was intensifying. But Makarova always found an explanation. There was no money for repairs, not enough hands. Help us, and then we'll manage. And people helped. They transferred money, brought bags of food, and believed the situation was temporary. Many felt anxiety, but it never translated into concrete action. Everyone thought roughly the same thing. Well, it's hard for her. It happens. She's carrying such a workload alone. The main thing is that the animals are safe. The main thing is that someone is doing this. And then Makarova started closing the doors. That was when those following the situation first got the feeling that something was very wrong behind those doors. This didn't happen all at once, but gradually, step by step. First, there were isolated refusals. Then it turned into a consistent system. Volunteers who used to freely visit the shelter and see the animals with their own eyes began to encounter obstacles. Some would show up without warning, only to find the gates bolted shut. Those who continued to insist were met with increasingly harsh and categorical refusals. Makarova began removing people from group chats, blocking them in messaging apps, and cutting off contact without any explanation. And it is important to understand, throughout this, her public activity did not decrease for a single day. Posts on Telegram appeared regularly, fundraising continued as before, and photos of animals appeared. But it became harder and harder to tell exactly when and where they had been taken. The pictures looked as if they had been taken in advance for future use and then posted as needed. The curators who had sent their pets to Forgotten Hearts found themselves in an extremely strange position. They continued to finance the maintenance of their animals, transferring money for treatment and food. But at the same time, they couldn't see them, not in person, and they couldn't even get fresh photos. Elena Kravtsova later told journalists that until the very last day, Makarova convinced everyone that everything was perfectly fine, that the animals were safe and being cared for as they should be. A few weeks before the volunteers entered the shelter, Kravtsova had handed over 2.5 tons of food. This food was supposed to feed hundreds of animals. The bags remained untouched and sealed. It becomes clear that the isolation of the shelter was neither accidental nor spontaneous. It didn't look like the chaos of a person who simply couldn't handle the workload and was ashamed to show the results. It looked like deliberate, methodical control. Makarova purposefully built a wall between the shelter and the outside world, cutting off everyone who might see what was actually happening there. The logical question arises: why did she need this? Meanwhile, the fundraising didn't stop for a single week. On the contrary, it only grew with each passing month. The mechanics of the fundraising were simple and yet very effective. A post would appear on the Telegram channel, a photo of a sick or injured animal with text underneath. An operation is urgently needed, or we are raising money for treatment, or save Rizhik, he won't survive without your help. Below were the bank card details. People read, looked at the photo, and transferred money. Many such posts were published, sometimes several a day. Each animal was a separate collection, each story an emotional trigger built on the same scheme: urgency, suffering, the hope of rescue. And it worked because people wanted to help, wanted to believe that their money was really going toward a good cause. At the same time, reports were published regularly. Photos of receipts from veterinary clinics, screenshots of transfers, words of gratitude. At first glance, it was a completely transparent system that inspired trust. But if you looked closer, it was practically impossible to verify any of it. Receipts could be old or even someone else's. Photos of animals could have been taken at another time, and the amounts in the reports might not match the actual expenses. And here is another important detail. The bank card into which the donations were paid was not registered to Makarova herself, but to another person. Who actually managed this money is a question that would later become one of the keys to the investigation. Volunteers who worked with the shelter and saw even a part of the inner workings noticed that the flow of monetary intake was constant and quite significant. The money went not only toward one-time treatments for specific animals, but also for food, maintenance, and the so-called expansion of the shelter. Meanwhile, the animals' living conditions improved very slowly, or didn't improve at all, judging by the rare photos that people managed to obtain. Some volunteers wondered, why, with such volumes of fundraising, did the animals look no better, and sometimes even worse, than before? Makarova always found an explanation for this. The expenses were enormous. Veterinary care was expensive. Every penny went toward treatment and maintenance. People listened and believed. They continued to transfer money because believing was easier and more pleasant than admitting an alternative. Could it be that Makarova really was spending everything on the animals? Could she herself have become a victim of circumstances, burned out, broken under the weight of responsibility she had taken upon herself? There is a theory that this is exactly what happened. Animal protection is hard work, and everyone who has ever tried to do it seriously, rather than just reposting photos of homeless kittens, knows this. You see suffering every day. You make decisions on which a life directly depends. You work without days off, without a normal salary, often without any gratitude other than what you invent for yourself, so as not to go crazy from a sense of pointlessness. And at some point, the internal resource simply runs out, no matter how hard you try to stretch it. Burnout in this environment is not the exception, but rather the rule. Volunteers snap, abandon shelters, fall into deep depression, and stop managing what they have taken on. This happens constantly, and it's not surprising, given the level of workload and constant emotional stress one must live with. Makarova worked almost alone, without systemic support, without a permanent team, without an officially registered organization. The shelter existed informally, on private property, without registration, without any legal foundation beneath it. Everything rested solely on her energy, on her decisions, and on her ability to pull this cart alone. And so, when the scandal broke and journalists began asking questions, she herself voiced exactly this version of events. Makarova said that her mother fell seriously ill in the summer, that she physically could not properly look after the shelter, and that she was ashamed to ask for help. That was why she allowed the situation to reach such a catastrophic state. At first glance, this explanation works and sounds convincing. A person faced with a tragedy failed to handle the load, didn't have time, or couldn't call for help in time. The animals faded away, not out of malice, but out of helplessness and despair. If one accepts this version as the primary one, then Makarova is not a monster or a cold-blooded criminal. She is herself a victim of circumstances, a person who sincerely wanted the best, but simply broke at some point. But there is one detail that doesn't fit into this neat picture. A burned-out person usually stops. They slow down, refuse new obligations, at least try to hold on to what they already have, and not take on anything beyond their limits. They stop accepting new animals and ask colleagues to step in and take over part of the burden. This is a normal, healthy reaction to overload. Makarova did the exact opposite. She did not limit the scale of her activities. She actively expanded them. During the very period when she was supposedly failing to handle the workload, the flow of new animals into the shelter did not decrease. It grew. Arrivals came from across the region and didn't stop for a single week. Makarova did the exact opposite of what a burned-out volunteer does. She herself actively sought new animals. She went to the scenes of disasters and emergencies. She took pets from other shelters that had closed or failed. She advertised Forgotten Hearts as a place that would take anyone, regardless of their condition or history. She didn't just not refuse. She literally attracted more and more new animals from all over the region to herself. At the same time, access to the grounds became increasingly closed. New animals were accepted willingly, but showing them afterward was refused. Curators who paid for the upkeep of the charges could not see them, either in person or in photos. Volunteers who wanted to check the living conditions were met with closed gates and silence in messaging apps. The burnout version does not explain the logic of this behavior. Something here doesn't add up. And then another question arises. Perhaps the answer should be sought, not in fatigue or circumstances, but in psychiatry? Because there is a diagnosis that quite accurately describes this exact picture. Animal hoarding syndrome is a recognized psychiatric disorder that is well studied and documented. A person with this diagnosis collects animals and cannot stop. They sincerely believe they are saving them, doing a good deed, and that the animals wouldn't survive without them. Meanwhile, they do not notice that the living conditions are rapidly deteriorating. They literally do not see the degradation around them because their brain refuses to acknowledge it. A defense mechanism of the psyche kicks in, blocking the awareness of reality. If you look at Makarova's situation through this lens, the symptoms indeed match. Hundreds of animals on one property, overcrowded cages, dirt, smell, increasing chaos. And yet the owner of the shelter is certain that everything is under control, that she is doing a good deed, and that the animals are safe specifically because of her. People with hoarding syndrome are not villains in the classical sense of the word. They are often traumatized people themselves, looking for an emotional connection they didn't receive from other humans. Animals become a substitute for human relationships, a way to fill an internal void, and their quantity becomes a kind of measure of their own significance and necessity. So, if Makarova is a hoarder, the entire picture of what happened changes significantly. It is no longer a story about conscious cruelty or fraud. It is a story about an illness, about a person who needs treatment, not a prison sentence. Psychiatrists describe such people as being unable to adequately assess reality. They keep suffering animals and yet completely fail to understand that this suffering is caused by them, by their own actions and inactions. The hoarding syndrome version looks convincing and explains much. The scale of the catastrophe, the growing chaos, the stubborn refusal to admit the problem, and the isolation from the outside world. All of this fits the clinical picture of the disorder. But hoarding syndrome has one key trait present in almost all described cases. And it is precisely this trait that Makarova did not demonstrate, which makes one doubt that her behavior can be explained solely by a psychiatric disorder. A hoarder does not control the situation. They are a victim of it. Animals gradually take over the space. Conditions deteriorate, and the person simply doesn't notice they are drowning. They don't manage the process. The process manages them. Neighbors complain about the smell. Acquaintances notice oddities. Someone calls sanitary services or the police. This happens almost always because a sick person doesn't know how to control the consequences of their actions. Makarova did control it. And this is a fundamentally important point. She purposefully blocked any help from the outside. Volunteers offered to come and help with feeding. She refused. Curators asked to see the pets they were paying for. She made up excuses. People wanted to take their dogs back. She wouldn't give them up. This is not the behavior of a sick person who has lost touch with reality. Makarova managed to ensure that no one saw anything until the very end. She carefully moderated the information that got out. Only the photos she selected were published. The reports were only what she deemed necessary. Makarova held the perimeter. The shelter was located in an S&T gardening community, on the outskirts, away from prying eyes. Neighbors didn't meddle. Everything looked quiet from the outside. Volunteers were not allowed on the grounds under various pretexts. Control over information and access was not an accident. It was a method, a conscious strategy that worked for a long time. She was not a victim of the growing chaos, as is the case with real hoarders. She created this chaos herself and carefully guarded it from outside eyes, building barriers between the shelter and the outside world. This doesn't look like an illness. it looks like something else entirely. And here, the darkest version arises, one that is difficult to say out loud, but impossible not to voice. Perhaps it wasn't about burnout or a disorder. Perhaps she simply liked watching them fade away. The conditions in which the animals were kept in forgotten hearts can be described in one word: torture. And this is not an exaggeration or an emotional assessment, but a literal description of what was happening there. Emaciation to the state of a skeleton is not a fast process. It is weeks and months of slow fading. The body first burns fat reserves, then starts breaking down muscle tissue. Then the internal organs fail one by one. The animal weakens gradually, day after day. First, it stops playing. Then it stops moving. Then it just lies down and waits. It waits for food that won't come. It waits for help that won't appear. It waits for the end that will come sooner or later. And here, a question arises that is impossible to avoid. How can one go to this territory day after day, see the slow fading of hundreds of living beings, and continue to live as usual? How can one observe this process and feel nothing, do nothing, call no one for help? The only explanation that comes to mind in such a scenario is pleasure. A sadist receives a psychological reward from the suffering of others. The longer the agony lasts, the slower a being fades, the stronger the effect, the more satisfaction they receive from the process. If you look at the situation from this perspective, the profile indeed fits: a closed territory where no one can enter, so that no one interferes or sees what is happening. A constant flow of new animals that she herself actively sought and brought in. Total control over their lives and their end. It all points in one direction. If Makarova is a sadist, it explains the main thing: why she didn't stop when she could. Why she continued taking new animals while knowing what was happening to the old ones. Why she didn't ask for help, even though help was offered by dozens of people. But the profile of a classic sadist doesn't match her behavior in one critically important aspect. A sadist needs suffering for its own sake. They need the process and the observation of it. And Makarova, apparently, needed something else entirely. A sadist needs a reaction from the one they are mistreating. They need direct contact with suffering, the opportunity to see, hear, and feel what is happening. The pain of the one they torture is the reason for it all, the ultimate goal, and the source of satisfaction. Makarova avoided contact. She was not present during the animals' agony. She did not watch their slow fading. When the volunteers finally got into the shelter, it became obvious. No one had been there for a long time. The animals were fading away in closed cages, in total darkness, without any attention, without witnesses. Many remains had decomposed so much that it was impossible to establish the time of death. This means that weeks, and perhaps months, passed between Makarova's visits to the territory. A sadist doesn't do that. Without direct presence and observation, sadistic pleasure simply doesn't arise. Makarova, apparently, didn't care. Not that it was pleasant to watch the suffering. She simply didn't care. Total indifference to what was happening behind the closed doors of the shelter. The animals existed for her not as a source of pleasure from their suffering. They performed some completely different function that did not require her presence or participation. And here is a telling moment. When journalists asked Makarova why she didn't remove the remains, she replied that whenever she went in there, she started having hysterics. She supposedly couldn't look at it, couldn't be near the results of what had happened. But at the same time, she continued to take in new animals, continued to run fundraisers, and continued to advertise the shelter as a place of rescue. This is definitely not sadism. A sadist doesn't fall into hysterics at the sight of the results of their work. They enjoy them. So, 3 theories have been checked, and none of them work completely. Not burnout, because a burned-out person reduces the load, and Makarova increased it. Not hoarding syndrome, because a hoarder drowns in chaos and is unable to control it, while Makarova built a clear system of isolation. Not sadism, because a sadist needs to be present during the suffering, and she didn't need to be, and even found it unpleasant. Then what is it? What explanation can tie all these contradictory elements together? To find the answer, one must look at the people who tried to reach out to Makarova throughout these months, and at exactly how she reacted to their attempts. Amalia Yereshova waited for a year and a half of messages, promises, endless excuses, and postponements. Her dog, along with the puppies, simply dissolved into forgotten hearts, as if they had never existed. What actually happened to them, Amalia still doesn't know. Perhaps they were adopted. Perhaps they faded away in the very first weeks. Perhaps their remains lay among the hundreds that the volunteers later found. There is no answer, and there likely never will be. Other curators tell the same story. They sent animals to the shelter, regularly transferred money for their upkeep and treatment, and asked to see the charges at least in photos. In response, they received either silence or standard excuses. And then, simply, a block without explanation. Many people have saved their message logs, and the pattern is the same everywhere. At first, willing contact. Makarova responds quickly, takes the animals without extra questions, and promises care and regular reports. Then a gradual distance begins. The answers become shorter and rarer. Photos are sent at longer intervals, and then they stop coming altogether. And finally, direct refusals and blocking. The curators felt something was wrong. Intuition suggested the situation was developing incorrectly. But they couldn't formulate exactly what the problem was, or what specifically was making them suspicious. Makarova didn't look suspicious in the classic sense of the word. She looked haggard, tired, and overloaded with work. A person who needed help, not someone who needed to be checked up on and suspected of something. A few people did try to take the animals back when their anxiety became too strong. Without success, Makarova wouldn't give them back. She said the dog had already been placed in a good home, and there was no point in bothering it, or that the animal was currently sick and couldn't be moved, or that the curator had no right to demand anything because the animal now belonged to the shelter and she made the decisions. Legally, all of this was an absolute grey zone. No contracts were signed when animals were handed over. Proving anything in such a situation is practically impossible. No documents, no legal grounds, no levers of pressure. People were backing down. Not because they didn't care what happened to their animals, but because they simply didn't know what could be done in such a situation or where to turn. But one of the curators decided not to back down and to see the matter through to the end. It was her persistence that ultimately set off the chain of events that led to the exposure. Elena Kravtsova curated several animals at once, which she had transferred to Forgotten Hearts at different times. She regularly transferred money for their maintenance and brought food. She repeatedly asked Makarova to show the dogs, at least on video or in fresh photographs. In response, she received standard refusals and endless postponements. But at some point, Kravtsova stopped taking these excuses for granted. She began to ask uncomfortable questions, no longer in private correspondence, but publicly, in general chats and groups where other volunteers were members. She involved people who had also transferred animals to the shelter and also couldn't get any information about them. The pressure on Makarova began to gradually build, and it became increasingly difficult to ignore. In response, Makarova went into a total defense. At first, she simply stopped answering messages and disappeared from chats for several days. Then, she would start reacting aggressively, accusing the curators of distrust and ingratitude. Then, she would fall silent again and drop off the radar. These cycles repeated several times, but the situation did not move from its dead point. There was still no access to the animals. Kravtsova did not stop there. When it became clear that nothing could be achieved through negotiations, she began looking for ways to get onto the shelter's territory without Makarova's permission. She found like-minded people among other volunteers who were ready to take this step. They agreed on a specific date for the visit and began to prepare. And here is what's important. Literally, a few days before this visit, Makarova was still assuring everyone that everything at the shelter was in perfect order, that the animals were alive and healthy, that there were no problems, and there was nothing to worry about. She was saying this to the same people who, in a matter of days, would see hundreds of remains and survivors emaciated to the bone. On the night of December 24th, a group of volunteers arrived at the Reknik Gardening Partnership, where the shelter was located. Inside, they were met by what everyone, without exception, would later call a scene from a horror movie. And this is not an exaggeration, but a literal description of what they saw. The volunteers immediately called the police. Officers arrived, inspected the territory, and began to record the situation. Everyone was in shock. Both the activists, who had mentally prepared for the worst, but not for this, and the police officers, who had seen a lot during the years of service, but not this. Now the main thing remained to be clarified. Where was Makarova at the moment her shelter was breached? And how would she react to her secret finally being revealed? The scale of what happened became clear only in daylight, when volunteers and police were able to inspect the entire territory. The shelter was located in a private house on the grounds of the Gardening Partnership. Cages, enclosures, separate rooms for keeping different types of animals. And this entire space was filled with remains in various stages of decomposition. The survivors were urgently removed from the territory and handed over to veterinarians, who immediately began fighting for their lives. Some still could not be saved. They wasted away over the next few days, despite all the doctors' efforts. Their bodies were too exhausted to recover even with proper care. Police cordoned off the area and began documenting what they saw. Photographs, inspection reports, a detailed inventory of everything found inside. This work took several days because the scale of the disaster proved too large for quick recording. When the news broke into the public space, the reaction followed instantly. The Forgotten Hearts Telegram channel, which for years had collected money and published touching stories of rescue, was deleted within a few hours. The V-Contact group closed with a brief note. A tragedy has occurred. An investigation is underway. No explanations, no comments, just silence where activity had been boiling until recently. Makarova was taken to the Ministry of Internal Affairs Department for the Aksaray district that same day. She was interrogated, her testimony was recorded, and she was released. At that moment, the investigation found no grounds for detention. And then something happened that no one expected. On the evening of the same day, literally a few hours after her release, a fire broke out on the territory of the shelter. According to local media, Makarova threatened to burn the building along with the animals that still remained inside after the main part of the survivors had been evacuated. The fire was extinguished quickly enough and did not cause serious damage. No, the woman herself was detained a second time after this, and this time she was not released. The Rostov Region Prosecutor's Office took the case under special control. A criminal case was initiated under paragraphs A and D of Part 2 of Article 245 of the Criminal Code, improper treatment of animals committed for pecuniary motives and resulting in the death or injury of several animals. The maximum sentence under this article is up to 5 years in prison. And this clarification, for pecuniary motives, is fundamentally important for understanding how the investigation qualified what happened and what motive it saw behind this entire story. Makarova did not admit her guilt, neither immediately after her arrest nor later, when the scale of the disaster became obvious to everyone. In conversations with journalists, she put forward her own version of events, which differed significantly from what the volunteers saw and the police recorded. Yes, animals had wasted away. She could not deny this. But, according to her, there were only a few such cases, not hundreds. Others allegedly dug a hole under the fence and escaped from the territory. Or they died from diseases they had even before entering the shelter. Or there were initially much fewer of them than the volunteers claim, who are exaggerating everything and blowing up a scandal out of nowhere. Why didn't she tell the volunteers she couldn't cope? She was ashamed to admit her own weakness. Why didn't she transfer at least some of the animals to other shelters when she realized she couldn't pull it off alone? She didn't think about it. Her head was occupied with other things. Why, in spite of all this, did she continue to actively take in new animals, increasing the load she already couldn't handle? She had no clear answer to this question. In one of her interviews, Makarova told journalists literally the following: "She is accused of fraud. They say she didn't feed the animals and specifically starved them to death. But this is untrue, because she bought food, she fed them, and she spent nothing on herself from the collected money. At the same time, next to the remains of animals that had died from exhaustion lay untouched bags of food, the very food that the volunteers had given her. The bags were sealed and had not even been opened. Makarova consistently presented herself as a victim of circumstances, who is now being hounded for a mistake, for a moment of weakness, for not asking for help in time, who deserves sympathy, not criminal prosecution. Such a defense tactic sometimes works when there is no hard evidence, when everything boils down to word against word, when one can appeal to human compassion and understanding. But in this case, the investigation began to dig deeper, checking her words and comparing facts with testimony. And in the process of this work, it discovered what Makarova had carefully hidden from everyone for a long time. The investigation established that the bank card into which donations were received was registered to another person, but Makarova actually managed it. Investigators pulled the full transaction history for this card. Donations came in constantly, practically every day. Transfers from individuals from all over the country for the urgent treatment of specific animals, for the purchase of food, for the maintenance of the shelter. People sent money because they believed that these funds would go to help those Makarova was saving. The amounts varied, but in total, over the months, they added up to very significant figures. And here is the main question that faced the investigation. Where did all this money go in the end? Because during the inspection of the shelter, no traces of these investments were found. Expenditures on veterinary care at such amounts should have been huge. The surviving animals clearly had not received medical assistance for a long time, as seen by untreated injuries and old fractures. No improvements in living conditions were observed either. On the contrary, the shelter's territory had clearly degraded with each passing month. The investigation began to compare the numbers. On one side, the receipts on the card, which could be tracked and calculated. On the other side, the actual expenses for the animals, which could be confirmed by receipts and testimonies from veterinarians. The difference between these values was supposed to provide the answer to what was really happening. When Makarova was asked directly where the collected funds went, she could not give a coherent explanation. She said she didn't remember, that she didn't keep records, that the money was spent on various needs, but she couldn't specify. In parallel with the investigation, the volunteers conducted their own calculation. They pulled the entire history of public collections, looked at how much money passed through the card over the last months, and compared it with what was actually spent on the animals. The figure they obtained as a result explained a great deal in this story. In 10 months, about 11 million rubles were received by the card managed by Makarova. 11 million. This is not a typo or an exaggeration. This is the real scale of donations from people across the country who wanted to help save homeless animals and believed that their money was going exactly to that. To understand the scale of this figure, it is enough to imagine what could have been done with these funds. With 11 million rubles, the shelter could have been maintained in ideal conditions throughout this entire time, paying for the services of qualified veterinarians for every animal that needed help, buying high-quality food in any volume, hiring assistants to handle daily care, feeding and cleaning, building new enclosures, repairing old ones, creating normal conditions for keeping hundreds of animals. For this money, Forgotten Hearts could have been turned into a model shelter that would be written about as an example to follow. Instead, the remains of animals that had died from exhaustion and dehydration, the survivors in critical condition. And at the same time, 11 million rubles passed through the card and disappeared in an unknown direction. A complete absence of any explanations as to what they were spent on. At this stage, it finally becomes clear what we are dealing with. It was a scheme, thought out, functioning, bringing in a steady income. Animals in this scheme were not the goal, but the means, a tool for extracting money from sympathetic people. Every touching story of rescue, every post with a photo of a sick kitten or an injured dog, every urgent collection for an operation. All of this was part of a mechanism that converted other people's compassion into cash. Now the picture had been fully reconstructed, and it turned out to be much more frightening than any of the options considered before. The logic of this scheme was extremely simple, and its effectiveness lay in that very simplicity. The more animals there are in the shelter, the more reasons there are to collect money. Every sick dog is a post asking for urgent help. Every rescue story is an emotional trigger that makes people open their wallets. A person sees a photo of a suffering creature, reads a touching text about how this kitten won't survive without surgery, and transfers money. Without thinking twice, without checking, without demanding a detailed report. Simply because they want to help and want to believe that their contribution will save someone. Makarova realized this and built a system that functioned for months. The flow of new animals into the shelter did not stop, precisely because this flow was necessary to maintain the scheme. New faces in the photos meant new posts in the channel. New posts meant new collections. And new collections meant new receipts on the card. The more animals you take in, the more money you collect. The math was elementary. The closed access to the shelter's territory existed so that no one could check what was actually happening inside. If volunteers were allowed in, they would see the truth. The refusal to return animals to curators was explained by the same logic. Every animal in the system was an asset that brought in a steady income. As long as a dog or cat is in the shelter, money can be collected for it. If you give it away, the source of income disappears forever. That is why Makarova did not give them away, inventing endless excuses. The dying animals? The outcome in this system was not a problem that needed to be solved. It was part of the process. Those who are gone do not require food, do not require treatment, do not require attention. Only the living create expenses. And new arrivals came faster than the old ones faded away. So the conveyor belt worked without interruption. This is not madness or a loss of touch with reality. This is not a disease that needs to be treated. This is not burnout from which one can recover. This is a business, cold, calculated, built on human compassion and the desire to help, on the trust of people who could not even imagine that their good intentions were being used like this. Terrifying, cynical, and yet incredibly effective. One last question remains that cannot be ignored. Why was this possible at all? How could such a scheme work for so long? Makarova is not a unique case, and this is perhaps the most frightening part of this entire story. Animal protection in Russia is a huge grey zone in which there is practically no regulation whatsoever. There are no official requirements for private animal shelters. Licensing for this activity is not provided for. No one conducts regular inspections of housing conditions. Any person can call themselves a volunteer, an animal rights activist, start a fundraiser on social media, begin taking in animals, and no one will monitor what happens next. The authorities found out what was happening in Forgotten Hearts only when it was already too late to fix anything. The administration of the Aksay district stated that the shelter operated unofficially and there was no one to check it. There was not a single agency whose duties included exercising control over such establishments. At the time of the latest publications in the media, Makarova was not in custody. The measure of restraint chosen for her was a recognizance not to leave. And here, it becomes clear that this case is not just a story about one specific woman who turned out to be a fraudster or an animal abuser. It is a story about a system that allows such people to exist and flourish, about people who sincerely want to help homeless animals and become victims of manipulation precisely because of their kindness, about the complete lack of control in an area where serious money circulates and where lives are at stake, about trust that is so easy to exploit when no one checks. The question everyone who has learned this story is left with sounds simple. How can I check where my money actually goes when I transfer it to help animals? How to distinguish real help from a scheme built to exploit someone else's compassion? The answer is discouraging. There is no universal way. And as long as that remains the case, new forgotten hearts will appear again and again.